Welcome all to ELIAMEP's online roundtable on the green transition. As you probably know, ELIAMEP is a Hellenic foundation for European and foreign policy, and I'm Manos Matsaganis, head of ELIAMEP's Greek and European Economy Observatory and a professor at Polytechnic University of Milan. Today, we will try to address a number of overarching questions. For instance, is the green transition faltering? Are we still on course to saving the planet? And if not, what needs to change in order to avert a climate catastrophe? I know all this sounds pretty grim, and these really are challenging times, but hopefully by the end of today's online roundtable, we'll all be wiser, more energized, and who knows, perhaps less optimistic. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists in alphabetical order. Emanuela Dousis is a professor at the University of Athens, holds a UNESCO chair on climate diplomacy, and is a senior policy advisor here at ELIAMEP. Phoebe Koundouri is also a professor at Athens University of Economics and Business and at Technical University of Denmark, but she's also director of the Sustainable Development Unit at Athena Information Technologies Research Center in Athens, and chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Network in Europe. She's also a former president of the European Association of Environmental and Natural Resource Economists, which is a very prestigious scientific association. Our third panelist, Nikos Mantzaris, is a partner and senior policy analyst at the Green Tank, an independent non-profit environmental think tank based in Athens. And Alessio Terzi is an economist at the European Commission's Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs, and he is also a lecturer in public policy at the University of Cambridge. His excellent book, Growth for Good, Reshaping Capitalism to Save Humanity from Climate Catastrophe, was published in May 2022 by Harvard University Press and discussed at an ELIAMEP webinar in June 2022. Now, without further ado, I have asked our four panelists to reflect on a number of questions and give us a short answer on each. And here is my first question. Many feel that the outcome of COP28 somehow fell short of what is required to avert a climate catastrophe. Is this a wrong way to seeing this? Are we still on course to meeting the challenge, unlike what some people believe? What is your overall assessment? I will ask from Emanuela.
Well, allow me first of all to thank you for the invitation to participate in this event and share with you some thoughts on the challenges of the green transition. Well, COP28 was critical because one of the issues discussed was the first global stocktake report. The global stocktake is a process for countries and stakeholders to see where they are collectively making progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and where they are not. And this report confirmed that we are not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the window for meaningful change is closing, and therefore COP28 was expected to bring about important decisions to move forward. However, the outcome failed to include a robust commitment to the phasing out of fossil fuels, which is essential to limit global warming. Countries agreed to triple renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency by 2030. And as far as fossil fuels are concerned, countries agreed to transition away from them in a just, orderly, and equitable manner to achieve net zero by 2050, which is to say that this commitment reinforces the go slow approach, which has long been the default position of countries that continue to produce or use a lot of fossil fuels. Notably, COP28 took place in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, a fossil fuel producing country, and the next COP29, will happen in Baku, Azerbaijan, another country dependent on fossil fuel production. Chairs of international negotiations can influence their outcomes. Therefore, my overall assessment on COP28 can be summarized in two main points. The first is that we have great expectations from a system that has inherent limits. Global climate cooperation under the UN auspices is important, but it is not a panacea. The COPs cannot provide comprehensive and holistic solutions needed to face climate change because they focus more on process than on matters of substance, which are left to countries to manage individually. And this brings me to the second point, which is that climate diplomacy is rarely effective when its scope is too wide. Negotiating on economy-wide emissions implicates virtually every aspect of states' domestic policy, energy, agriculture, urban planning, transportation, and so on and so forth. What is more is that we cannot have substantial agreements when all the countries, in negotiations where all the countries of the world are involved, because seeking a global agreement serves only to lower the bar to the lowest common denominator. So the question is if whether climate diplomacy can help, has a role to play in helping the green transition. I think that it has a role to play if it focuses more on action, more on implementation, and less on searching for new targets. If we think more pragmatically on about how to implement concrete solutions for the future. Green transition means a shift from the world of today, which depends on oil, gas, and coal for about 80% of its energy, to a world that is not based on fossil fuels anymore, but operates on clean energy. And this shift is not an option among others. It's the only option according to science if we want to prevent further global warming. But while the idea is widely embraced, there is no clear consensus on the pace of change, on who will pay, and how it will be achieved. So the starting point is to get practical. In each of the economy's polluting sectors, fossil fuels must be replaced by clean technologies and practices. Clean technologies are already there, and businesses, infrastructures, markets, jobs are gradually remolding so that they can adapt to them. Cooperation in specific areas and coordinated support for the right actions can contribute to further progress. For example, if the use of renewable energy is to become more widespread, electricity grids will first have to be upgraded. In addition, action should focus more on specific economic sectors because each of the main polluting sectors is different from the other. The problem of upgrading electricity grids, which is essential for the expansion of renewables, is different from the problem of curbing emissions in aviation or in shipping, or the problem of deforestation. Such collaborations in specific sectors already exist, but are considered by traditional diplomacy as side events. And in fact, many initiatives have been launched, such as the International Solar Alliance, Zero Emissions Vehicles Alliance, and so on. But there is no transparency on how they are implemented. Therefore, we are only at the beginning of the green transition. Fossil fuels will get phased out when the so-called alternatives become mainstream. So getting these alternatives to fossil fuels in the markets, it's the urgent task at hand.
All right. Thank you. At this point, I wanted to know what you think about the outcome of COP28. Phoebe, 5 minutes.
Now you can hear me, which is good. And thank you very much for the invitation. Let me start by saying that I participated in 20 out of the 28 COPs, and I experienced huge improvements throughout the last 20 years with regards to the outcome of the COP. So my view is positive because I've lived through COPs that were much lower in terms of the actual outcome and in terms of the potential impact that they could create. This last COP achieved to emphasize energy transformation, tripling renewable energy, as Emanuela said, coal phase out, striving for zero and low carbon fuels well before mid-century, shifting away from fossil fuels to achieve net zero by 2050, ensuring just and orderly transition while doing so, and also acknowledge the vast role of energy security during the transition. It has also focused on technological advancement. It resulted in saying that we need to boost renewables, carbon capture, low carbon hydrogen production, especially in the hard-to-abate sectors. It also resulted in saying significantly non-carbon dioxide emissions, focusing on methane by 2030, and also recognizing the continuous cost reduction and increased accessibility of mitigations technology, particularly wind and solar. And it also called for sectoral shifts, that is reducing emissions in the road transport sector via infrastructural development, deployment of zero and low emission vehicles, and also sending the message for eliminating insufficient subsidies, focusing especially on poverty and just transitions. So overall, this is what we want to do. Right? This is what is not there. And we want to engage national entities, the countries, subnational levels, the financial institutions, the business sectors, the NGOs, the civil society to do. So in principle, we are on the right track. In addition, it did not only focus on mitigation, it also brought more structure to the loss and damage fund for adaptation. So I am pleased that we are with the right wording and with the correct direction. Now, what is missing? What is missing, of course, is targets and specific ways to monitor and continuously assess the contribution of each and every country, of each and every sector with regards to the actual achievement of the reduction of the emissions and also of the adaptation policies. However, let me argue that I never expected the COP to have the capacity, and no other COP, because there is a biodiversity COP as well that integrates with the climate COP. I would have never expected this kind of fora to actually set the targets. The targets are set at regional level and country level, and these are what one needs to monitor and assess. It is true that if we looked at the map of Green Deals, let's say 5 years ago, if you looked at the map of the world 5 years ago, you would clearly see almost nothing except the European Green Deal with regards to the to a pledge for climate neutrality and climate resilience by 2050. Nowadays, you see a map full of green deals and pledges. And if you add all these pledges, are they enough? The answer is no, because if you add all these pledges and nationally determined contribution, you will be able to keep global climate temperature, average temperature at above 2 degrees Celsius compared to what we had in the pre-industrial era. And we want to keep it only 1.5 degrees Celsius above what we had during the pre-industrial era. So what we are doing, what we are pledging is not good enough. And what is more worrying is that pledges are higher than the actual implemented policies. So the pledges usually translate into a very detailed policy framework that achieves implementation of the pledges. And this only happens in Europe, where we have a very detailed policy framework that tries to achieve the climate neutrality target by 2050 and Fit for 55 by 2030.
All right.
So let me close by saying it was not expected from the COP to set the targets and the monitoring structure, but it was expected to do the stock take, and it did it. All the resulting documents are on the right direction. Now we need to work vividly on regional level in order to transpose these pledges into implementable strategies. This is what Europe is doing as a leadership example, and the rest of the world should follow. The technology is there. The financing is there. We just need vivid work on the policy scene and political engagement, serious political engagement as a priority. Thank you.
All right. Nikos, what do you think?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this important discussion, which is also very timely, if you think about it, ahead of the EU elections. To answer your main question, are we on course to meeting the climate challenge? I would say that the science and the data prove that we are not on course to meeting the challenge of keeping the increase in global temperature below 1.5 degrees compared, of course, to pre-industrial levels. Ample reports on that, but I will just cite the latest emissions gap report, which uses a very well-accepted methodology to measure the gap between what we should be doing and what we're actually doing. First of all, by the time it was published in November 2023, 86 days in 2023 had already been recorded with temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. More importantly, and that was also briefly mentioned by Phoebe, the report showed that mitigation efforts in line with current policies will result in global warming of 3 degrees Celsius throughout the century. If you implement unconditional nationally determined contributions, that would limit global temperature to 2.9 degrees Celsius. Whereas if we have the additional achievement of conditional indices, which is tougher, would improve things marginally by limiting warming to 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. These numbers indicated we're clearly off track. Now, if you look at the agreement itself, there is really no strong call for a fossil fuel phase out this decade, which is absolutely necessary. And there are also numerous loopholes allowing production and consumption of fossil fuels to continue. Therefore, this agreement, and I understand all the arguments made by Phoebe, this agreement is very much below what is necessary to protect us from climate change. Of course, there is a positive aspect. We had the breakthrough of the Loss and Damage Fund, aimed at helping developing countries to adapt to climate change. It was also briefly mentioned, but it is characteristic that it took so many caps to mention fossil fuels in an agreement, and this is considered by many as a major success. In my opinion, these are all negatives, but there is a cause for constrained optimism. This is none other than the fact that economies around the globe are progressively becoming more involved in the deployment of renewables and other climate-friendly technologies. We have already witnessed this in the past in the case of the United States, and especially the comparison between the Obama and Trump administrations. What do I mean by that? We all know that Obama's presidency pioneered climate policy in the US, and he was also instrumental in achieving the biggest breakthrough in global climate policy, the Paris Agreement, together, of course, with the French and the EU diplomats. It was also during the Obama presidency that coal plants started to retire, to shut down in the US. That's really improved the actual climate performance of the country. On the other hand, Trump, who succeeded Obama, vowed to revamp the coal industry. Despite his efforts and his political will to do that, he failed. In fact, if you look at the actual numbers, the coal capacity shut during Trump's first 2 years in office topped that of all of the units retired during the first 5 years of the Obama administration. Why did this happen? Because the shift of the energy industry towards renewables and gas, in the case of the US, due to their favorable economics compared to coal, could not be reversed. And that is something we're actually experiencing all over the world, in different places of the world, with renewables being cheaper than fossil fuels. And that is perhaps the reason why we can be cautiously optimistic. Looking ahead, where does the challenge lie? We know from a recent analysis that the CO2 emissions from all developed countries in the world in 2023 fell back to 1973 levels. So that's improvement. The weakest link in our battle against climate change is clearly China, and to a smaller extent, India. But even with China, there is some hope. China has by far the greatest deployment rate of renewables, and many experts specializing in China claim that 2024 may be the peak year in emissions for the biggest polluter in the world. This would be a turning point in global climate policy, I think. In a nutshell, whether we manage to meet the challenge of limiting the rise of global temperature to 1.5 degrees is a very tight race, clearly a race of existential significance for us, for humans. Will the economic benefits of clean energy beat the interests of the fossil fuel industry? Eventually, I think yes. But the big question is whether this will occur in time to prevent the escalation of the climate crisis. It's tough to predict. We can only keep fighting, in my opinion, every climate battle along the way, and there are many. And in my opinion, there's no alternative to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. Alessio?
Yes, thanks a lot. I'm very happy. It feels like a homecoming. I think the last time I spoke at EliaMep, we had a similar composition of the panel, at least in part. So very happy to be back. It feels like being in Greece for a second. Anyhow, thanks. It's also hard to speak at the end of experts, of such experts in this field, because I feel that there is not so much I can add or contribute. Perhaps I will say just one thing, one thought, and it sort of builds on what Emanuela, but also Phoebe were already hinting at, and that is to say, I teach one of the classes I teach within my courses on cooperation on climate change at the global level. And I start the class with with a QR code, you can run these surveys in real time within your class. And I ask them, are you following COP? Did you follow the last COP? And these are students of sustainability, of business and sustainability, or economics and sustainability. Usually the vote is split in two, 50%. So 50% follow it, 50% do not follow it. And which is surprising because in a way, you already know that climate change is something they care about, they're studying that. And when you drill in a bit to understand why that is the case, it has much to do with what Emanuela and Phoebe were hinting at, which is expectations. And so what do you expect out of it? And let's say for those that do not follow it, they approach it with the expectation, with a bit of a textbook expectation. And so saying, this is a global problem, it would require a global solution, it is so big and it is causing mass destruction and a collapse of biodiversity, and we're seeing the effects and extreme weather events and so on. So why do we still do the petty politics of discussing among nations, and why don't we just come together and find an agreement to try and tackle this problem together? And then there are, those are the ones that have a bit stopped following it because they say, I come out of these discussions and it's not like we've reached the final agreement, we've reached the final signing of the treaty where we finally put all our differences aside. For those instead that do follow it in greater detail, they see a bit what Phoebe was mentioning, what Emanuela was mentioning as well. So the details which matter. And so there is a lot of progress, technical progress that was made. Overall, what I tell them, which is my opinion, of course, it's not necessarily the truth, is that my view is a bit in between, in the sense that indeed my expectation is that we're not going to tackle this problem in a coordinated, orderly fashion at the global level. And therefore, I do not have these high expectations out of COPs, which means that, your question was, how are we doing on the climate fight after COP? To my mind, we're doing, the challenges that were there beforehand and they're true after. And they sort of remain true. So I do not see COP28 as a watershed moment in neither direction. So it is not a failure. It is not the watershed moment. I look more at what Nikos was hinting at and Noel as well. So the role of technology and where do we stand from a technological point of view on those aspects. Just one word before concluding. But again, to reiterate the importance of COPs, I have not attended, so conversely from Phoebe, I do not have the let's say, personal experience of the attendance. But I speak and I discuss with a lot of people who attend. And they tell me that we have to bear in mind that COP is not only the inner circle of the negotiations among countries, which is instead, what the media focuses on. And so they take that as the ultimate metric of success and failure. Was there an agreement? Did we sign something? How many member states went? And that is the inner circle. And I'm using circles because I understand that this is really how COP is organized in alternative circles or expanding circles. And the reason why they're expanding circles is that you have heads of states, but then you have companies, you have NGOs, you have the indigenous people, you have a huge amount of actors that are interested in climate change. I think the number arrived to almost 100,000 people attending this final time. And COPs are an occasion to create and build connections among these people. And so there are the technologists or the companies that are showcasing technology. There are universities that are showcasing their courses and how they are contributing to climate change. There are activists that are trying to understand what works better in different settings. There are teachers that try to compare how they teach about climate change and to bring students on board. So there is a host of people that are working on these issues. And this is why, to my mind, beyond the narrow negotiations, these COPs still carry value because they allow for these connections to be established. And in a way, they bring to everybody's attention climate change. For 2 weeks, this is the topic that dominates the media cycle. And it is a good reminder for people that don't work on climate change as I do and the people in this virtual room do, that climate change is important. And so even just for that, I think that COP is important.
Thank you, Alessio. And thank you all for keeping to the time, more or less. All right, here's my second question. My second question. We Europeans like to think that we are at the forefront of international efforts to make the economy greener. And I think that's true to a great extent. Nevertheless, we have recently found out that the European Commission is ready to remove some of the good agricultural and environmental conditions that farmers must meet in order to receive subsidies under the Common Agricultural Policy. This seems to go against our perception that we are pioneers of the green transition. Is it still the case? What exactly is going on? Can I ask Phoebe first?
Well, we are definitely the pioneers. We are the leadership example of transposing the vision of the world as it has been documented in the SDGs, the UN Agenda 2030, the 17 goals, and the 169 targets within the goals. There is nowhere in the world such a detailed effort in a policy framework to transpose this global vision, this unique global agreement that was signed in 2015, September, in New York by 163 countries. So we are definitely pioneers, and we pioneer the transformation to a green and digital world in all systems of the economy, the energy system, the land use system, including agriculture and forestry and water and biodiversity, the marine use system. The European Green Deal is the best example in the world of the transposition of the SDGs into a policy framework, and it is holistic and integrated enough that brings together the three main systems of an economy and tries to create a sustainable interaction between the systems, the economy, the society, and the environment. So we are definitely showcasing the way. We are leading the way. I chair the UN Global Climate Hub. This is the Global Climate Hub under the auspices of the General Secretary of the UN and part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network that aims to develop detailed pathways for climate neutrality and climate adaptation for each and every country in the world. And we work at the moment in 120 countries with a vision to create these detailed implementable pathways, which basically translate into the optimal mixture of technologies, financial instruments, social instruments, policies, fiscal instruments, and socioeconomic narratives that will spell out the transition pathways that are different in each and every country, and then support them financially and socially in order to be implemented. So I know for a fact that there is no such policy framework, so efficient policy framework. Is it perfect? No, it is not perfect. We've done an AI analysis trying to see how much of the holisticness of the SDG is there in the European Green Deal. And of course, a lot of it is there, about 70%, but definitely the European Green Deal is lacking behind with regards to the goals that are relevant for social cohesion. And this is what now is paid. This is what now is being transposed into a serious political problem, because although we have the elements that are there to support the technological advancements, we also have the elements that are there to support financially and fiscally the transition, because this is a transition that requires lots of resources. We are lagging behind in terms of the elements that support the engagement of the implementing stakeholders. And let me explain that. And let me use the gap that you mentioned, that we are willing to lower our, let's say, ambition, or not the ambition, but maybe give more time and be less strict. The gap is definitely getting greener and in the right direction. We have higher green ambitions. We want to contribute to Green Deal targets. We want to enhance conditionality. We have have eco schemes, we have rural development funds, we have operational programs, we have climate and biodiversity targets and objectives, and we also have this overarching goal to create a fairer CAP. However, we have not invested seriously and timely in creating the capacity between the farmers and all other stakeholders, meaning everybody that is engaged in the value chain of agricultural production and consumption. We have not meaningfully financed upskilling and reskilling programs in order to engage all these stakeholders in meaningful and timely investments, infrastructural investments, that is produce capital investments, but also human capital investments, and also a deepened understanding of the interaction between natural capital and the other forms of capital in creating sustainable production value change. And what is even more important, we have not managed to create the knowledge that is needed to enable all these stakeholders to transform in a way that is profitable for them. The green transition, let me just say one sentence, the sustainability transition, and in agriculture especially, provides a wealth of opportunity for lowering costs through circular economy, through cost competitive renewable resources technologies that can reduce production costs, can increase the market share, and in such way support and increase profitability for different scales of farming. This has not been worked enough, and because of that, it has not been integrated into the farming sector, and that's why we are delaying and at the end of the day, having to admit that maybe what we try to do is too ambitious. It's not too ambitious, it's that we delayed the actual support of the real implementation. Thank you.
All right. Nikos, what do you think about that?
Well, indeed, Europe has been at the forefront of global climate policy and international efforts to render the economy greener. It has the most efficient emission trading system. It's the flagship climate policy instrument in the EU. It recently established the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's a pioneering regulation which, among other things, aims at stimulating the adoption of carbon pricing policies in countries outside the EU, so stimulate climate action outside the EU. Furthermore, EU's role in forging international climate policy agreements in COPs throughout the years is undisputed, I think. But progression, even in the EU's case, is not linear. It's not a linear process. There are steps back. The recent withdrawal, for example, of the pesticide reduction law proposal by the European Commission is one example of that. Another example is that the Sustainable Food System Framework, which is supposed to accelerate and make the transition to sustainable food easier for consumers, was never proposed. So two important pieces of the Green Deal actually are delayed. Who is responsible for this? In my mind, it's the big agri-lobby and its close association with conservative and far-right-wing political groups in the EU. Let's try to understand this better. The policies included in the farm-to-fork strategy, as well as the nature restoration law, also opposed by the same groups, attempt to prevent against four things, essentially: the loss of biodiversity, the pollution of water and soil, as well as to cut greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture, and that's a lot of emissions. All the above are prerequisites for sustainable farming and therefore align with the long-term interests of farmers. It's really common sense if you think about it. Without healthy soils, clean water, and pollinators, farming has no future. Whereas increasing floods, fires, and droughts due to climate change are already jeopardizing yields across Europe. So why is there opposition? because these new policies considered by the European Commission threaten the interests of big agri, which under the current model receive the largest share of subsidies. The common agricultural policy operated until now on a certain principle. You can call it the bigger your farm, the bigger your subsidy model. As a result of this policy, the number of farms in the EU decreased by almost 40% between 2005 and 2020, forcing also approximately 5 million farmers out of business. Now, because the subsidies of the CAP amount 1/3 of the EU's budget, the threat for those interests is huge. And that offers, in my opinion, some interpretation about the opposition to the changes of the current model. What the EU should do is to launch an EU-wide campaign to inform all farmers, not just big agri, about the benefits of sustainable farming. There is, for example, a recent first-rate scientific study by the Food Systems Economics Commission, which shows that a food system transformation pathway, as they call it, really exists. If it is implemented, by 2050, undernutrition will be eradicated. Cumulatively, 174 million lives will be saved from premature death due to diet-related chronic diseases. In addition, food systems could become net carbon sinks by 2040. 1.4 billion additional hectares of land will be protected. There will be the nitrogen surplus from agriculture will be reduced, will be cut in half. And biodiversity loss will be reversed, not to mention that 400 million farm workers across the globe could enjoy a sufficient income. On the contrary, if we keep on doing the same thing, according to the same study, if we continue the so-called current trends pathway, food insecurity will leave 640 million people underweight in some parts of the world, while obesity will increase by 70% globally. Food systems will continue to drive 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and food production will become increasingly vulnerable to climate change, with the likelihood of extreme events dramatically increasing. Now, all this information needs to be systematically and responsibly communicated to all farmers in the EU. But more importantly, the subsidy system should change. Public subsidies should be directed towards aiding farmers in transitioning to sustainable practices that will address this crisis. In addition, farmers should be rewarded for engaging in practices that benefit the environment and contribute to the health and well-being of our ecosystems. This, in my opinion, is the truth path to effectively supporting farmers and answering the needs they're currently raising.
Thank you, Nikos. Just to say at this point that we have already commissioned a policy brief on CAP reform here at ELIAMEP, so we will have the chance to discuss the issue in more detail in a future online roundtable. Alessio, is there anything you would like to contribute to this question?
Yes, you're great at doing the advertisement for ELIAMEP work in progress. I need to borrow from your handbook, Manos.
All right.
No, I'm glad. I mean, of course, it goes without saying that I'm not here sitting to speak on behalf of the Commission, which is, I'm glad that both Phoebe and Nikos have already said something that I was going to say in any case, irrespective of my current employer, which is that the EU remains at the forefront of climate action. This is beyond questioning. And so I'm glad Phoebe has gone into the details as to why that is the case and showing it at greater length than I can do. And so I'm glad I don't need to add anything on that point. Perhaps building on what Nikos also was already saying in great detail, I just wanted to give you a sense of a few statistics on agriculture. And the reason why I want to do that is that some of the perception, let's say, perhaps in part because I do live in Brussels, sit in Schumann at the center of the Commission buildings. And so I've been hearing some pushback against the Commission. And it was something along the lines of, the farmers have arrived and you've been watering down the European Green Deal. And at the end of the day, these are not that many people. It is not so much so big in terms of employment. It is not so big in terms of GDP. So why are you bending to this specific pushback or lobby group or however you want to phrase this? And I think that one key point to keep in mind, at least that was very relevant when looking at the problem from my perspective, is that they had the public on their side. And so that in a lot of the surveys that we were looking at, well, actually people, the broader public, so not only 1% or 2% of people related to agriculture, but the broad public was looking with sympathy at the cause of agriculture and protests of farmers. And the statistics I wanted to give you a sense of is that, and Nikos has already mentioned this, but agriculture contributes massively to CO2 emissions, to greenhouse gases, and therefore to climate change. To put this into perspective, it has higher emissions than manufacturing and construction combined. It is more than twice in terms of emission than in Europe, than shipping and flights. So aviation and shipping, agriculture is twice as much. If you consider also land use, so if you consider land use and forestry combined with agriculture, it is just below transport, which is obviously a huge source of CO2 emissions. And the reason why I'm saying all this is that, to my mind, I suspect that the public is not entirely aware, the general public is not entirely aware or realizing that agriculture is not this nice thing of being close to nature and in contact of nature, and therefore because fighting climate change and restoring the environment is also in favor of nature, then agriculture is necessarily good by default. Right now, agriculture is on a path that is not sustainable. And again, Nikos was making this point very in a granular way. And so the problem is there. And so to my mind, the question is, how do we address this problem? Because we cannot fight climate change by saying, okay, the agriculture, we put aside, we just focus on the rest, it will not work. And so the key point is how to do that. In part, it will have to do something to do with, Nikos was calling for information campaign. You were mentioning an information campaign towards farmers. I would expand it even more broadly to the general public on some of these statistics and realizations. But part of it has to do with smart policies, and so being smart on the policies we put on the ground. And so we take that point, and I'm sure that there are better ways and worse ways of doing that. Some of the worst ways, to my mind, or an example of the worst ways in which this has been done, at least at the national level, was the Dutch case on nitrogen. And effectively, what the Dutch government was doing on nitrogen was saying, we have some targets, the targets are there, we have to respect them. And so to respect them, we're going to use this draconian measure of effectively closing down or buying out farms and closing them down in order to reduce our nitrogen emissions, let's say, and or flow into rivers. And this, to my mind, is, it's not the way of going about any of these challenges or trying to tackle, even climate change through these means. It is exactly at the opposite of what the literature suggests that we want to do, which is keep people engaged in the economy, not to buy out their sector, close it down and tell them goodbye. This is the end of what you were doing. And so, these are examples, to my mind, of how you do not want to go and intervene in agriculture. There are better ways, and this is a reminder that we should look for those and keep them.
Emanuela? Thank you, Alessio.
Well, I totally agree that the EU is at the forefront of international efforts, and I would like to add that it is turning to the direction of a holistic approach. In essence, the European Green Deal is the EU's response on how to implement the Paris Climate Agreement. And it has multiple readings. It aims to preserve the climate while protecting the health and well-being of citizens. And at the same time, it aims to create a sustainable economic model through a series of reforms ranging from the decarbonization of the energy sector to investing in green transport, and from a circular economy restructuring to a new deal for agriculture. And since its launching in 2019, new legislation has come up under the Fit for 55 package, which in essence combines the strengthening of existing climate policy with new ones to deliver on the agreed targets and make different EU policies fit with a new agenda. However, we haven't given much attention to the just transition. The movement of Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, was the first reaction concerning a carbon tax, which would affect a critical component of daily life. Now we have the farmers who are protesting in several European countries against low food prices and high EU environmental standards and are demanding fewer green rules. Farming is a politically sensitive sector, struggling with high energy prices and competition from abroad. And politicians cannot afford to ignore them, especially now, a few months before the European elections and also national elections in many European countries. This is why there is a backlash in the agricultural part of the deal. But there is no backlash for the rest of the deal, because achieving the goal of climate neutrality remains a top priority for the European Union. And the policies already in place are unlikely to be withdrawn. But more attention should be given to the just transition. And just transition concerns not only those who will lose their jobs because they have been trapped in polluting activities for decades and now should shift to more sustainable pathways, but all those who need safety nets to face the challenges of the green transition and shift to sustainable practices. So there must be some sort of compensation and also incentives to comply with the imperative of the green transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuela, and thank you for raising the question of whether the green transition is just enough. I'd like to pursue this topic a bit further. Okay, we have already mentioned farmers. They are up in arms, and the Commission seems ready to compromise. But we also have political developments in Germany, in the Netherlands, and elsewhere, not necessarily linked to farmers' movements, that show that there is a rather significant, perhaps not very large, but quite significant section of the electorate out there that appears to be quite strongly opposed to the costs of the EU Green Deal to them personally, whether actual or perceived costs. And what troubles me, and I'd like to hear your views on the topic, should all these people simply be dismissed out of hand as deniers of climate change? Or is it possible that they might actually have a point? You know, they have a legitimate grievance against either the EU Green Deal as a whole or the way it is implemented or whatever. And if they do have a point, then is there anything that ought to be done in order to make progress towards a greener economy faster as well as more palatable to public opinion? Let me ask Nikos first.
Thank you. This is a very interesting topic. I think it would be useful to analyze a bit the examples you mentioned. Let's start with the Netherlands. The short answer is yes, we should be worried about these developments. In the recent elections in November, the right-wing party PVV won. And this party wants to rip out the Dutch Climate Act and also wants Netherlands to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. However, it didn't seem to me that PVV won the election primarily because of its anti-green agenda, but mainly because of its anti-Islam, anti-immigrant agenda. Of course, this is also very negative in my opinion, but it's a different issue than climate change denialism. In addition, PVV will not govern alone. Its leader will not be the Dutch Prime Minister. It is highly likely that we will have four parties to form the new Dutch government. And also 50% of the cabinet will not have any political ties, will come from the outside. So it will not be as if PVV will be free to impose its agenda. Going to the people, I would also like to point out that according to the latest EU barometer, 72% of Dutch citizens say they have taken action to fight climate change in the last 6 months. So this is significantly above the EU average of 63%. Therefore, it's not like the average Dutch citizen is close to climate change denialism. If we move to Germany, this country ranks even higher than the Netherlands with 76% the same question. Not all is good, contrary to the Netherlands, where we had 11 percentage points gained in that question since the last EU barometer in 2021. In Germany, there was a worrisome decline of 2 percentage points between these two polls. More importantly, perhaps Lindner, the leader of FDP, recently urged Ursula von der Leyen to pause new EU legislation aimed at curtailing greenhouse gas emissions during a time of economic stagnation. But if we look at the actual political actions, Lindner himself, along with the Greens and the Socialists from the government in Germany, helped push a heating bill that effectively bans new installations of oil and gas heating systems in favor of heat pumps, which use cleaner energy, electricity in particular. This is clearly a green measure. Moreover, Germany has set a target of having a nearly carbon-neutral electricity sector by 2035. It's very important. We're talking about the biggest economy in the EU, and also they're going to do that without nuclear power. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be worried. We should be worried, but I'm saying that the EU Green Deal already has developed some strong anchors in the political system and in the society. And that resulted from the two crises it withstood. First, as you remember, it was the COVID pandemic, right after its announcement, where the right-wing political groups and governments across the EU attempted to completely scrap any notion of a green transition. The second major crisis was Russia, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, where we had all these voices aiming at taking us back to coal and effectively sinking all of the EU's climate-related aspirations. EU replied with climate progressive measures in both cases, to a large extent. Of course, one can criticize it could have been greener, etc., but the direction was clear, climate progression. The Green Deal is also tested now, very recently, with the Nature Restoration Law, and I believe it will have yet its bigger test come 2027, when we will have the new ETS system covering buildings and road transportation. What will this do? It will basically raise the cost of using fossil fuels used for heating and passenger transportation. It will not be easy, but in my mind, there is a way to make progress in these two crucial sectors without causing social upheaval. The key, the answer, is on the priorities we set on how to use the funds that we have available. Let me briefly explain this because I think it's an important point. During the recent energy crisis, we, Greece, and other EU member states used an enormous amount of money to reduce the energy bills. Greece, in particular, spent 10.7 billion euros for this purpose in a very short period of time, just 16 months between fall of 2021 and the end of 2022. And this support was essentially subsidies for the consumption of fossil fuels. It was to some extent justifiable simply because EU was caught completely off guard with respect to this crisis. However, ETS2 that is coming is a different situation. We know it's coming, we can prepare for it. And if we choose to apply measures like the ones during the energy crisis, essentially subsidies promoting consumption, no fund will be sufficient, in my opinion. It is crucial, therefore, to channel the available funds from the EU ETS, for example, the Social Climate Fund, and other sources to address the root of the problem, which is none other than the dependence of households from fossil fuels. We recently studied this together with facets, and we saw that the smart thing to do in Greece is to invest in building renovations in conjunction with heat pumps as well as solar PVs for the building sector. Analogous measures for the road transportation sector as well. We found that if we implement these measures, this will permanently shield the households, especially the more vulnerable ones, from future spikes in energy prices, while also permanently reducing their carbon footprint, a win-win situation. We discovered scenarios which, if implemented, will lead to net profits for the citizens of up to 1.6 billion euros per year. So if we are proactive in this direction, we will manage to achieve real climate progress while also making the transition truly just for the citizens, because I also agree with Emanuela that just transition is a major issue in the Green Deal.
All right. Thank you, Nikos. Can I ask Alessio to chip in?
Yes. It's a very good it's a very good point. As before, I find myself very aligned with what Nikos was saying, but with better rhetorics or better data than I can. For sure, I was looking at I think yesterday or the day before, Our World in Data came out as they always do with these great visualizations or let's say compiling data for the whole world. And they did one of them precisely on the question that you're posing of denialism or whether people are in denial of climate change or not. And you can just move your arrow around and look at the whole world. And basically, there's a majority in every single country that says, climate change is real, it's caused by humanity, we've got to do something about it, it is an emergency. So you combine these questions together, I can give you I was looking at the numbers for Germany, for the Netherlands. In Germany, it's 83%. In the Netherlands, it's 80%. It's in line with what Nikos was saying, although for a more specific question. So even for countries that are turning rightwards, the problem of climate change is known. It is a concern, and it remains a concern. And so I don't think that this is a matter of denialism, and it's a matter of how to make this work. And I don't think effectively what we're trying to do is a huge structural transformation by historical standards. I often, I go around at events talking about a green industrial revolution. This is not only for PR reasons, but it is because I think that what we're trying to do has parallels with a huge structural transformations that we've seen historically in the past, in moments in which consumption and production, housing, agriculture, clothing, transport, and more have been completely redesigned or changed. And this is what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do it, we're putting in place policies to make it happen even faster. And so it is no surprise, in the same way in which there were protests at the time and concerns at the time, it is no surprise that there are protests and concerns at this time. And of course, they have to be managed. They have to be managed well, because if you don't, people will oppose the policy of the moment or the change of the moment. They will see that their profession is being shattered, that the regional economy is losing, their main source of income. That might be coal extraction or production, and they will vote against it. They will protest. They will go up in arms, and will not allow policies to be put in place to make this happen fast. It doesn't matter if this is in the interest, of the wider community, of wider society, of their children and grandchildren, of the planet. You can phrase it however you want, but it's not going to work to bring people on board. Emanuela was already linking to this, and the idea, to my mind, that what we're trying to do is, yes, a huge structural transformation, but one that generates economic opportunities. And so making sure that, you're losing a job, yes, but we're also trying to give you a way to reconnect to your economy, to a new economy, to a green economy, and have a way to contribute to this. And so I think that is the huge challenge that we're trying to put in place. I don't think that anybody has, the magic wand or the secret to do this well. Often I am told that, look at the US, of course, they're doing it the right way. They're doing the subsidies, whereas Europe is doing all the sticks. With the carbon taxes, the ETS that Nikos was talking about, rightly. I don't think that anybody has the magic wand. They are doing a lot of subsidies, which politically might be more appealing. It is true, it is less of a stick, and nobody likes sticks on their head, me first. But at the same time, doing the green transition with subsidies is impossible. It's going to be super expensive, even for the US. Even they will run out of fiscal space to do the green transition only with subsidies. And so we might want to learn something from their playbook, but they will have to do something else, because the IRA alone, even if doubled or tripled, will not allow them to reach net zero by 2050.
That's a very good point. Thank you, Alessio. I'll ask another question very soon on specifically on the industrial policy aspects of the green transition that Alessio mentioned. But before I move on to the next question, I'll ask Emanuela and Phoebe to respond to my previous question about how to manage protests and whether something needs to change either in the substance of the EU Green Deal or in the way it is communicated. Emanuela?
Well, to add to what Nikos and Alessio have already said, I would like to make three brief points. Well, the first is that there can be no green transition without an equally profound change in society. The implementation of certain policies intensifies inequalities as the economic burden is shifted onto the weakest. So solutions to the climate crisis and the green transition should not be limited to technical issues. They also need to have a social dimension. So we need to look seriously at how we can protect the most vulnerable and give more attention, as I previously said, to the just transition. And we also need to enhance society's resilience so that it can deal with interconnected and simultaneous crises in the year ahead. So it is clear that all these changes cannot be achieved by the invisible hand of the market. So we need a stronger state, a state which is capable of fulfilling the state's role responsibly, serving the needs of the most vulnerable, providing the necessary safety nets, and cutting funding to activities that impede our well-being. Because if well-being is not shared, if it is not affordable and attainable for all, then the ensuing large-scale cost unrest will bode ill. Worse, the disruption will come about through radicalization and tensions. The rise of populism in Europe and elsewhere is extremely worrying, especially as the European elections draw near. Can the populists do what needs to be done? How they can deal with the climate crisis if they don't believe it's real? Well, my second point is that we need to build better bridges of communication between science, policymakers, and society. And the recent experience with the coronavirus pandemic has shown that we must rely more on scientific knowledge for policymaking and political decisions. But the implementation of these decisions requires the cooperation of civil society. So in the context of climate change and green transition, we must inform citizens why the green transition is needed and keep them up with the dilemmas that arise in this process, to inform them about the benefits they will gain and how they themselves can also contribute to this process. And my last point is that for a long time, we have viewed climate change as an environmental problem requiring technical solutions. We are now certain that it is a social problem as well, where the solutions must include economic, political, cultural, and institutional changes. And some of these solutions have the potential for transforming society in ways that address multiple goal challenges related to climate change, including poverty and inequality, food security, water security, biodiversity loss, and health. So the mobilization of public opinion on climate is recent and driven not just by studies and reports and data, but by an increasingly intense focus on extreme events, forest fires, droughts, floods, heat waves, and the alarm about the climate is the greatest motivator for the green transition.
Thank you, Emanuela. Phoebe, do you have anything to add? on this?
Yes, let me quickly say a few things based on the science that derives from the Global Climate Hub. First of all, the transformation of the land use system into a climate resilient and climate neutral one is doable. We have modeled the food systems and the land systems, including agriculture and forestry. And we've shown through modeling, of course, which is, however, very close to what is actually happening on the ground, that the climate goals, the biodiversity goals, and the food security goals are reachable within Europe. First point. Second point, we have also modeled with a cost minimizing, very detailed, holistic model, the energy system of Europe. And we can showcase that the 2030 and the 2050, even the 2040 targets identified in the climate law and being transposed into national laws, the whole European Green Deal targets are again doable. They are achievable. So, and the same goes for the transition of the marine use system. So the basic systems of the economy can be transformed into climate neutral and climate resilient, and even I will go further to say into sustainable systems. We have the technology, we have the, in addition to the technology, the social, fiscal, financial, and governance innovations that are needed in order to achieve the transformation on time. Now, after we simulate these three different solution pathways, the three different systems of the solution pathways, we ask the question, can we really finance this transition? And financing the transition does not only mean implementing the technological and other changes, socioeconomic changes that are needed in order to achieve the goals, in order to implement the European Green Deal climate policy. It also means that you have the means to mitigate the regressive effects of the vulnerable households. Again, the science. We simulated a large general equilibrium model that showcases that it is possible to implement the climate policies of Europe and through a package of measures that will mitigate the regressive effects of the vulnerable population, including lump sum transfers and targeted energy efficiency measures and job retraining programs and using subsidies for low carbon technologies. It is possible to implement the policies, the pathways that we derive for the land use system, the energy system, and the marine use system, and at the same time achieve more equality, higher Gini coefficients in all regions of Europe, and at the same time increase GDP and increase employment multipliers. So it is doable. However, it is difficult. And what is the most difficult part of it is the aspect that has been identified, that has been mentioned by all previous speakers. We need to engage the stakeholders. Engaging the stakeholders in this particular case means once you have the science and the sustainability pathways that you are recommending based on the science, you need to actually start working on the ground, which means participatory approaches to engage all stakeholders, all the groups that are relevant in each and every detailed transformation into co-designing the final implementation pathways. You need to make the stakeholder co-designers, owners of what they are actually will be called to implement. You need to make them even shareholders of what you want to implement. So what is important is not just to co-design with them, but understand that co-designing means that you seriously invested in their capacity to become co-designers. And this capacity comes from serious education, serious understanding, serious upskilling and reskilling programs and vocational trainings. We have launched together with our decarbonization and resilience report for Europe, the Balkans, and Asia at COP28, together with this report where we show the pathways that I've just mentioned and how you finance these pathways. We have also launched a report that identifies the changes in the occupations skills that will be needed for implementing the European Green. What we identify there, it's a big AI exercise, which basically puts together all the existing policies and laws and regulations, assumes that, assumes that these laws and regulations are going to be implemented. What will be the changes in the labor market? And we find that 85% of the jobs and skills that are needed for the implementation of the European Green Deal by 2030, not even by 2050, are not yet here. So we are talking about a major transformation of the labor market that is needed, which means that you need to have a huge investment plan on upskilling, reskilling, but also a huge investment of transforming the curricula of the university in order to produce the people that are going to implement this European Green Deal, in order to produce people that can really engage and not oppose out of non-existing capacity, the transformation, because people understand that they have to face climate change, they have to face biodiversity collapse. Okay. These two are reducing their economic growth, but they don't have the means, the capacity to truly engage and really support the transformation. And this is absolutely
I must stop you
needed.
There. Thank you. That was a good point. Right. We have already touched upon implications of the EU Green Deal for industry, but I would like to probe you to go into that a bit more deeply, because one of the criticisms against the EU Green Deal is that if followed to the letter, it might wipe out Europe's industrial base, right? Rather than producing automobiles in Europe, we will all import electric cars from China, right? With all the geopolitical implications, not just the industrial policy implications. Do you find this criticism justified? Is it possible to have both thriving manufacture and a decarbonized economy? And how should we deal with the inevitable trade-offs and policy frictions? I think I will ask Alessio first, because he has written extensively on what he calls a green industrial revolution. So Alessio, over to you.
Yeah, it's difficult. I imagine this question like asking you, are welfare states important, or welfare policies important in 5 minutes? Because indeed—
You can have 6 minutes.
It's okay. It's okay. Yes. So to my mind, it's important to dissect a bit the problem. And that is to say, there is a criticism which is a long-term criticism, and which relates to the end of your question, which is it possible to have an economy that is industrialized, that is growing, and at the same time is decarbonized? And is this even possible from a principled point of view? And that is something that indeed I've been writing a lot about and arguing in favor of, using a variety of arguments, but effectively the short version, the 5-minute version of it is, look, in part because of what Emanuela was saying, and which is extreme weather events are becoming more and more frequent and intense. People are realizing that climate change is real. It is becoming a concern, and the more we don't act, the more it will become worse. And at some point, let's say the equation will balance in a direction that forces action. So if you start from this premise, it forces you to see that the green transition will eventually happen. And once you see it in that way, you realize that business as usual is not possible. And that if business as usual is not possible, it's actually in your interest, from an economic perspective, from a business perspective, to try and pioneer the green technologies that will power the new economy, whether you look at it at the energy sector, at the transport sector, at the agricultural sector, at the heating sector, and so on. And if you get there first, you're locking in some technological advances that will reverberate for decades to come. And so that you want to get there, and you want to get there fast. And so in a way, the policies that we put in place to try and push our companies to engage with new technologies and green technologies are in the interest of long-term prosperity. And that is on the long-term dimension. But obviously, as Keynes would say, we're all dead in the long term. So we also have to look at the short term, or we cannot forget about the short term. And I think that the short term, we look at the situation in Europe now. And indeed, industry is struggling. It is struggling particularly in the industrial heart of Europe, so in Germany. And that is leading to some backlash, at least ideological backlash. And to my mind, it is important to realize there as well that much of the difficulty that industry is facing in Germany and beyond right now, manufacturing, most of it does not come from environmental legislation. Most of it, and most of the added costs, do not come from the ETS, from carbon pricing. They come from an energy shock. Effectively, Europe went through a massive energy shock last year, which had nothing to do with climate change. It had to do with the invasion of Ukraine and with the subsequent with geopolitical tensions, effectively. And that, to my mind, is just a reminder that the green transition can actually be aligned with that dimension as well. So in the moment in which we're phasing out methane or fossil fuels, phasing in renewables, which carry also, which have lower costs, this will help Europe as well, and it will help our competitiveness by giving us cheaper electricity, and one that is less susceptible to geopolitical clashes and struggle. So again, the short term mixing with the long term. That being said, and that is my final point within the 5 minutes, is to say, of course, there is an interregnum in between. There is a period in between where you're rolling out these green technologies, you're rolling out new energy sources, but the costs of energy are higher in Europe. And that is obviously a concern, because if that leads companies, European companies, to go bankrupt now, by the time that energy sources will be cheaper and widely available, we might not have the companies there anymore, or the large companies there anymore. And that is the framework within which we can start discussing and debating whether it is useful to use some industrial policy tools to help companies accompany that transition right now. So focus also on the short term and help them however, make this transformation. So it is not the kind of energy subsidy that Nikos was talking about during the energy crisis, but rather an industrial policy that tries to accompany the transition, and so cushion the blow for now on competitiveness, and help our current companies to move into those green technologies that we think are going to be the engine of growth for Europe into the future.
I forgot to say that ELIAMEP has also commissioned a policy brief on industrial policy, which is going to be published in a couple of weeks. So we'll go back to these fascinating issues. Emanuela? Well,
I will be very brief. To add to what Alessio has already said, I think that Europe won't be more competitive if the ambition is lower, because the cost of inaction will be far greater than the cost of prevention. So weakening climate policy will ultimately cost more, as worsening climate change would hit economies harder with devastating floods and fires and so on and so forth. So there will be some initial transition costs, but we have to think about the benefits, and it is very much worth to take these costs. Another point is that green policies are needed. I agree with Alessio. They are needed to establish also a technological advantage that will help EU countries compete with other countries, such as China, for example. And countries who transition now will have opportunities to be leaders in green manufacturing, which will also bring new jobs. But we have to think also about the heavy industry, where the costs are very, very high. And I think that their international cooperation will be critical to enable the deployment of viable zero emissions technologies, because there is no point in being a first mover if you will be instantly wiped out by the competition. So international cooperation through coordinated standards of carbon prices, for example, in each of the heavy polluting sectors, can ensure that there is a market for zero emission materials. And this is very important in giving industry the confidence to invest in new technology processes.
Thank you, Emanuela. Phoebe?
Yes, the transition has, as Alessio said, two basic levels: is the short run and the medium run, and let alone the long run. So in the short run, it is quite important to understand that the per unit value, for example, of clean energy is lower than the per unit cost, the cost of fossil fuels. And this is relevant for many other technologies. So the crucial element here is not whether it is affordable to implement the existing European Green Deal policies in conjunction with the industrial policy of Europe and with the digital policy of Europe, because we should not forget about the digital. We have two very elaborate policies: the digital policy of Europe that focuses on the Digital Service Act, Digital Markets Act, European chips, European digital identity, artificial intelligence, European data strategy, space data, European defense, EU and US Trade Technology Council coordinating the approaches of the Western world. And at the same time, we have this twin transition industrial policy, again focusing on the green and digital solution pathways. And we know that the existing technologies of the green and digital transformation per unit are on average lower cost than the non-green, non-sustainable existing existing technologies. The difficulty is the infrastructural transformation. Who will invest on the grid that is needed, the network that is needed to support clean energy, sustainable water systems? So there you see a vivid need for public-private partnerships. All the money or all the public money in the world and in Europe are not enough for this transformation. It is crucial to realize, to make it explicit, to understand that most money around the world and also in Europe are in private hands. So what is needed is clever public-private partnerships that will allow the initial investment cost for the infrastructural basis to support the deployment, the massive deployment of the already existing technologies to accelerate. Of course, we have competition, but I would say that competition always existed, and it's up to us to make clever strategic and geopolitical choices in order to embrace the benefits of the competition rather than being introverted and rather than being very insecure with regards to our relationship with China and India. And I can spend a lot of time explaining that, which I don't have now. But I want to also say that there is also a very difficult geopolitical issue with regards to these investments within Europe. Europe has a big strategic competitive advantage with regards to wind energy in the north and solar energy in the south. And what has happened to Europe the last decade? Well, we invested in Russian fossil fuels, in natural gas. Why? Why was the south of Europe not being given the extremely powerful opportunity for growth based on solar energy provision? And nowadays, this is also enhanced by the ability of Southern Europe to also produce hydrogen, which is an ability that is not there in Germany or the Netherlands or Central Europe. So let me say here that we, of course, understand the worry of the industrialists in Germany and in the Netherlands of the potential relocation of energy sources that can relocate industry as well. But this is something that needs to be discussed explicitly in Europe. It is always the elephant in the room. But if we really want, as one country, to invest in our competitive advantages with regards to the green transition, at least in the energy sector, our advantages are away from Central Europe, and they are located in North and Southern Europe, and this should be given a serious thought, because if we don't allow the South to empower the green transition with its huge potential for sun energy and solar energy and hydrogen energy, then we be basically killing the potential of Europe to compete on an international level.
Thank you. Nikos, what do you think? Will the EU Green Deal wipe out European industry, or should we compromise between the two or find a way to combine both?
Thank you. On one hand, the way that I see it, we have a very harsh reality. I would call it the mother of all realities, and this is none other than climate crisis itself. The simple fact is that without cutting industrial emissions, it will not be possible to achieve the already outdated climate target that the EU has set for 2030, namely to cut the net greenhouse gas emissions by 55% compared to 1990 levels. And this inability becomes even more evident if one looks at the trajectory of industrial emissions, which has largely remained flat in the last decade. So there is no debate on whether industry should cut its emissions and change in order to accomplish that. On the other hand, protecting the competitiveness of EU industry is a very big challenge. And given the huge role that industry plays in the EU's economy, it is evident that protecting it must be a priority. But let's discuss why is this really a challenge. First of all, there is the purely technical aspect. And I think this requires some explanation. It's different from electricity. In electricity, it has become almost straightforward to cut emissions by displacing polluting and more expensive fossil fuels that was mentioned by the previous speakers with clean and cheaper renewables. Pretty straightforward. But the same cannot be done in industry. It cannot be done, for example, in the cement industry. Why? Because the biggest part of the emissions does not come from burning fossil fuels, but from the process itself, namely the calcination of limestone, which produces clinker. This is the main precursor of cement. And this process emits a lot of CO2. And therefore, the main abatement technology there is carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and utilization, CCS or CCU, which means that you don't avoid the CO2 emissions per se, but you capture the emitted CO2 and either store it underneath the earth or you utilize it to produce various products in the chemical industry. However, this is all particularly expensive to install, and that is where the challenge comes from. The question is how this cost can be covered without hurting the competitiveness of EU industries in the cement and other sectors, example steel, compared to similar industries in countries that do not have an ETS established and therefore don't have to pay for the CO2 they emit. The second big challenge comes from the recent revision of the EU ETS directive, which covers energy-intensive industries since 2005, of course, and this revision imposed drastic changes in the way that industrial competitiveness was ensured so far. So what was happening so far? The primary measure to prevent the relocation of EU industries abroad, the so-called carbon leakage threat, was to offer industry emission allowances for free. In other words, waive their obligation to pay for the CO2 they emitted. Of course, this prevents carbon leakage, but it also removes the incentive for changing the industrial process. And thus, this led to the stagnation of the industrial emissions that I mentioned earlier. So to address this, the EU decided to phase out free emission allowances by 2034 and cut them by almost 50%, 48% to be more exact, by 2030. Obviously, this will negatively impact the economics of major industrial sectors in the EU, as they will have to pay for their emissions. They didn't have to in the past. The EU, now, on the other hand, definitely did not remain indifferent to these two challenges. First of all, it established the so-called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM in short, which essentially puts a price to the carbon content of imported goods from third countries, do not have an ETS, in 5 key industrial sectors, as well as electricity. This way, industries operating without an EU ETS in such third countries cease to have an advantage compared to their EU counterparts, because in order to export their products to the EU, they have to pay the same amount of money for CO2 as EU industries, in the same sectors, of course. The second thing that the EU did is to significantly increase the size of the so-called Innovation Fund. It's, again, an ETS-related fund, which is used to finance projects which permanently reduce the carbon footprint of EU industries. The Greek industry already seems to be utilizing this instrument. For example, the largest cement industries in Greece have major projects approved by the Innovation Fund. And if you look at the announcements, they are both CCS projects, and they're supposed to cut by almost 3 million tons of CO2 their emissions per year. If you compare it with the emissions in 2022, we're talking about 65% emission reduction compared to 2022 levels. The same also applies to a Greek refinery, which also will benefit from the Innovation Fund, and where there the captured CO2 will be used to produce a chemical methane. This, in my opinion, is the smart way for industry to address the challenge. Utilize funds for transforming the industrial process permanently and render the process clean as possible. This way, industrial competitiveness will be shielded against the phase-out of free emission allowances, and the EU industry will also set the example for its counterparts in third countries.
Thank you, Nikos. You raised the issue of how the green transition is brought forward in this country, Greece. So I would like to ask a final question, whether in your opinion, Greece is doing what it needs to do in order to save the planet. What are the critical issues? Are we on target? Are we doing what needs to be done? Phoebe, what do you think? 5 minutes.
We are not saving the planet. The planet is saved and can live in extreme situations, more extreme than this one. We are saving ourselves in the planet, and it's up to us to destroy us or save us. And it's good that it is about us and not about the, a bigger universal reach, let's say. Now, with regards to what Greece is doing, I like to measure everything because I think unless you quantify, you cannot manage, you cannot improve. And as you know, I'm not the first person to be thinking that. So every year as United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, we issue a report that showcases the progress of each and every country against each and every sustainable development goal, and each and every target within these sustainable development goals. We are talking about 169 targets that allow you a very detailed picture of how well a country is doing with regards to implementing the targets. And I'm going to talk about the targets of the UN Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goal, because this is a framework that mirrors the efforts of the European Green Deal. But as I said before, it's more holistic because it focuses, of course, on the ecosystems, it focuses on the economy, but it has a very vivid focus as well on social cohesion, on the society, and of course, the collaboration between the different stakeholders that need to implement them. Country-wise, Greece rates 28th among the 34 countries within the European Union and the Balkans, which we assess according to their implementation of the SDG targets. The worst performing targets in Greece are SDG 13, climate action, where actually we have a very low level of implementation facing major challenges. The other major challenge is the implementation of SDG 12, sustainable and responsible consumption and production. SDG 8, which is about decent work and economic growth, and SDG 4, which is about policy education. And then we are facing serious challenges with regards to all the other targets, including clean and affordable energy, including no poverty, innovation and infrastructure, and all the other environmental SDGs like sustainable use of marine resources and sustainable land use. Where we seem to be doing rather well is with regards to reducing inequalities, sustainable use of water resources, and increases towards more sustainable health system. We can discuss the KPIs and the data that I use that allow measurement of these performance indicators. However, it's a picture that puts Greece, as I said before, 28th among the 34 countries that are included in the European Union Sustainable Development Report that I co-author. Having said that, I would like to say that in particular with regards to climate change, Greece is much more advanced with regards to mitigation, trying to reduce emissions, trying to keep up with the targets within the European Green Deal, with regards to the target of our energy mix, the sources of our energy mix. We are okay with regards to the targets that have to do with energy efficiency. However, we are extremely behind in the crucial element of climate adaptation. And as Alessio and Manuela said, and also Nikos, we are currently at a phase that we are experiencing the extreme severity and increased frequency of climate-related natural disasters, heat waves, forest fires, floods, and we are yet to have a sensible approach towards adapting to climate change. We are yet to have vulnerability maps for each and every region within Greece, and then have strategies for adaptation, meaning protecting the citizens, the infrastructure, the economic activity from the effects of these extreme weather events. And we are yet to have actual strategies to be implemented when the event happens. So I would urge the government, the country to take adaptation more seriously. It tries to do so. There is an adaptation big life IP, but there are a lot of money coming from the RRF that has created fiscal space for the green and digital transformation investments. So we have no excuse that we don't have the money. There are a few billion there for adaptation work together with mitigation work, and we should be clever enough and quick enough to use it, absorb the money, and safeguard the citizens, the society, the economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Emanuela?
Well, as Phoebe said, Greece is directly affected by climate change because all the Mediterranean is what the scientists call a climate change hotspot. Therefore, Greece has every interest in advocating for robust measures and in supporting international and European initiatives. Now it is expected to align its development process with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and the European Green Deal. But the question is how a country get prepared to implement the green transition. Well, significant steps have already been taken, and I think that a policy to deal with the climate crisis has gradually begun to take shape. The decision to put a complete end to the operation of the lignite units and mines by 2028, far earlier than other countries, EU countries that still produce lignite. The Just Development Transition Plan, which includes a long list of investments supporting clean energy for the regions affected. Then the Recovery and Resilience Plan, which makes green transition a top priority with 38% of its total allocation devoted to reforms in investment and investments that support the green transition. The good pace of renewables. And in May 2022, the Greek parliament approved the so-called National Climate Law, which regulates the transition to climate neutrality and focuses on those areas that need more coordination. And I think that the national climate law is the strongest statement a state can do to show that it's taking the transformation needed to achieve climate neutrality seriously. So undoubtedly, all these are positive developments. We are in the process of implementing the climate goals. Greece has already reduced its emissions by approximately 29%, and by the end of this decade, we should triple efforts to achieve 55%, which is the collective European goal. There are many challenges in this process, but if we look at the bigger picture, the green transition is a great opportunity for Greece because today we depend on fossil fuels, an energy source that we don't produce. We have lignite, which is not of a good quality. We are searching for gas. We haven't found it yet, but we have plenty of wind and sun all over the year. These are renewable energy sources, clean and domestic, confirmed and not presumed, that we can further exploit. So for Greece, the green transition means shifting from a system reliant on imported fossil fuels to a system based on domestically produced clean energy. And this changes everything. Most importantly, the position of Greece in the geopolitical map. Well, geography is destiny, yet it is for Greece to decide what destiny means and in which direction it will go. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. Alessio, I asked you beforehand whether you would like to say anything on Greece, and you said no. Have you changed your mind? That's fine.
No, I continue learning about Greece things.
Good. I just didn't want to pass you over. Nikos, would you like to be the last to give an answer to whether Greece is on the right track, or whether perhaps we need to do things differently? What do you think?
First of all, I agree completely with what Phoebe and Manuela said about adaptation. We're not doing enough about adaptation, so I'm not going to repeat what they said. I will focus merely on mitigation. And the truth is that Greece has made tremendous progress in recent years in cutting its emissions from one sector, not all sectors. And that sector is electricity production. We estimate, and I use the word estimate because we will know for sure officially in a few days, that the emissions from thermal power plants in 2023 were less than 50 million tons of CO2. This number, 10 years ago, it was 45. And 4 years ago, it was 27. So we're talking about a reduction by a factor of 3 in 10 years and almost by a factor of 2 in the last 4 years. The main reason behind this progress is clearly the delignitization of electricity production and the substitution of lignite by the less polluting fossil gas at first, and in the more recent years, massively by emissions-free renewables, mainly wind and solar. The role that PPC played in this path since 2019 was pivotal. It is because PPC was and continues to be dominant in the electricity sector that
PPC drastic transformation. PPC is a state-owned electricity firm.
Ακριβώς, exactly, the state-owned utility. Right. It is because of the drastic transformation of the company from a fossil fuel dominated company to one of the leaders in the renewable sector that we observe this overall progress in the electricity sector. Now, because electricity production used to be, at least until very recently, the most polluting sector of the Greek economy, climate progress in this sector translated into climate progress overall. According to the latest official data, and Emanuela mentioned that, Greece reduced its net greenhouse gas emissions in 2021, that's the latest available, by 29% compared to 1990 levels. This is just 1 percentage point behind the EU 27 average. And this is progress because during the previous decade, Greece was consistently among Europe's climate laggards in terms of actual absolute climate performance. Now, keeping with the electricity sector, at the pace we're going to completely decarbonize the electricity sector by 2035. One major prerequisite to achieve this, because you asked about the challenges, is to develop adequate electricity grids for further deployment of renewables. A second prerequisite is to build electricity storage infrastructure, pumped hydroelectricity, batteries, thermal storage, or green hydrogen, in order to balance demand and supply of electricity. Perhaps the most important threat that stands between a fossil-free electricity system by 2035 is all these new fossil gas plants that are being planned and are bound to play a role in Greece's electricity mix. If their role is significant, then this will, no matter what we do, displace renewables. And this means that Greece will not accomplish the target set in its more recent National Energy and Climate Plan, namely to cut emissions from the electricity production to less than 4 million tons of CO2 by 2030 and to practically zero by 2035. All that concerns the electricity sector, indeed, Greece is among the leaders in the EU in progress when it comes to the reduction of the electricity sector's carbon footprint. Things, however, are very different in other major sectors of the green economy. Again, we're talking about mitigation. For example, the road transportation sector. Greece's emissions since 2013 remained flat. And I'm looking at 2013 for comparison purposes because it is the year when emissions from the electricity sector started to decline significantly. The stagnation is also observed in the other sector of the brand new ETS system, namely the residential building sector, and also industry that we spoke about before. Thus, the challenge in the coming years until 2030 would be to reduce emissions from these sectors. It is no accident that that was also the focus of the recent revision of the EU ETS. Industry was and still is part of the EU ETS, but because of the free emission allowances that were offered to most of its subsectors throughout the years, there was no incentive for drastic changes in the industrial processes. Therefore, we had a flat profile, flat trajectory in emissions. Hopefully, with the changes and the funds available to industry through the latest revision of the EU ETS, this will improve. As far as road transport and buildings go, again, the hope is on the brand new ETS system that was created with the main aim of cutting emissions from these sectors. Therefore, in a nutshell, and when we speak only about mitigation, Greece has made significant progress in the electricity sector. There are specific challenges that need to be addressed to continue on this path. And there's definitely a lot that needs to be done with respect to at least 3 other sectors in the imminent future. I'm not talking about 2004, 2050. I'm talking about road transportation, buildings, and industry until 2030, before saying that Greece is doing its bit to save the planet. And I agree, of course, with Phoebe's comments. We're not saving the planet, we're saving human existence on the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. It's nearly 4 o'clock. No, it's nearly 5 o'clock in Central Europe and nearly 6 o'clock in Greece. So I will bring this online roundtable to a close. I thought that was a rather good discussion. It would have been nice if we had more time, but I think we gave it a go at having a start on discussing these rather complex but so important issues. Many thanks to all our panelists, and also thanks to those of you who watch us online. Have a nice evening.